At 18,000 feet above the Solomon Islands, the air was thin, the sun merciless, and the war utterly personal. Lieutenant Richard Bong, barely 23 years old, watched in horror as his wingman's P-38 Lightning spun helplessly toward the Pacific, 3 Japanese Zeros circling above like vultures over a dying animal. Bong was alone now, his canopy filled with the silver glint of sunlight off enemy wings. The lead Zero was already sliding into firing position. He had maybe 4 seconds before the 20mm cannons chewed through his cockpit. Instinct screamed climb, bank, escape. But instinct had been getting American pilots killed for months. So Bong did something that no instructor at any airbase in California or Arizona would have ever approved of. He rolled his plane completely upside down and yanked the control column forward. Not up, but down, diving toward the ocean while inverted. His vision exploded in red. Blood flooded his eyes. The instruments blurred. Gravity reversed itself. For 2 impossible seconds, he was flying blind, but alive. And when he rolled level again at 12,000 feet, the Zero that had been on his tail was gone, overshooting helplessly above. That day, by accident and desperation, Richard Bong discovered a maneuver that would change air combat forever. In the summer of 1942, somewhere between the endless blue of the Pacific sky and the glittering, indifferent ocean below, the war in the air had taken on a shape that every American pilot learned to fear long before he ever saw it. The perfect white curve of a Mitsubishi A6 M0, banking effortlessly through sunlight, its tight turning circle closing like the jaws of an invisible predator. It was not the largest, nor the fastest, nor even the most powerful aircraft of the war, but it was a machine that, in the right hands, seemed to obey thought rather than physics, and in the early years of the Pacific Campaign, it outflew, outclimbed, and outturned almost everything the Allies could throw at it. When Japan entered the war in December of 1941, their naval aviators were already veterans of 100 unseen battles fought above the cities and river valleys of China. They had refined their tactics over years of blood and smoke, learning, with cruel patience, the delicate mathematics of energy management and deflection shooting, the art of forcing an opponent into a position where escape became physically impossible. By the time American pilots met them over the Philippines, Java, and the Coral Sea, the Japanese fighter corps had already mastered the one maneuver that mattered most: the turn. The Zero could turn tighter than any Allied aircraft in existence, not just a little tighter, but by a margin that was the difference between life and death. At combat speeds, its turning radius was nearly 400 feet tighter than the P-38 Lightning, and 500 feet tighter than the F-4F Wildcat. To the untrained eye, that might sound like a small detail, a few hundred feet of geometry drawn in the sky, but to a pilot fighting for his life at 300 miles an hour, that difference meant that while he completed one circle, the Zero had already completed 1.5, sliding smoothly into his blind spot and locking onto his tail with surgical precision. Instructors back home in California still preached the sacred gospel of the horizontal dogfight, the kind of close, swirling engagement that had defined aerial combat since World War I. But over the Pacific, that gospel had already been rewritten in fire. Every pilot who tried to fight a Zero in its own domain learned the same fatal lesson. If you turned with it, you died. And yet, in those early months, doctrine was a harder enemy to kill than any Japanese ace. Reports from the Philippines and the Dutch East Indies painted the same grim picture again and again. American pilots, eager to prove themselves, dove on Japanese formations with the textbook boom and zoom tactic, a high-speed pass from above, a burst of fire, and then a steep climb to safety. But if the first burst missed its mark, if the Zero survived that initial surprise, the American aircraft's fate was sealed. The Japanese pilot would immediately throw his plane into a hard, horizontal turn, forcing his heavier opponent to follow. The moment the American tried to pull the same maneuver, his aircraft began to bleed speed, its nose lifting, its engines groaning under the strain, its energy leaking away like blood from an open wound. The Zero, lighter by nearly 1,000 pounds, simply slipped inside the curve and fired. Again and again it happened, in the skies over Java, over the Coral Sea, over the burning wrecks of ships below. The same pattern, the same outcome, the same quiet horror of realizing that the aircraft you trusted with your life could not physically match the geometry of your enemy's flight path. By the spring of 1942, squadron commanders in the field were sending home reports that sounded less like tactical evaluations and more like confessions. We cannot win turning fights against this aircraft. But the problem wasn't only the Zero's agility, it was what it represented. The Japanese aircraft was a masterpiece of design born from a ruthless philosophy: remove everything that does not help you kill. It had no armor behind the pilot's seat, no self-sealing fuel tanks, and no redundant systems for safety. Every ounce of excess weight had been sacrificed for speed and maneuverability, making it not just fast, but fluid, a living thing in the air. An American plane, by contrast, was built like its pilot: cautious, durable, careful. Its strength was survivability, its curse was gravity. Even when American pilots did everything right, approached from above, attacked in groups, maintained altitude advantage, the Zero's turn radius could erase their advantage in a heartbeat. You could dive away, yes, but you couldn't stay in the fight. You could make a pass, but you couldn't linger. And so, little by little, the Pacific sky became a place of fleeting, desperate engagements. Sharp, one-sided duels in which the Zero's pilots dictated every rule. In those months, the mathematics of survival were mercilessly simple. The Japanese pilots had trained together for years, mastering formation, flying with near-telepathic precision, their hand signals and radio calls so minimal they could coordinate attacks in silence. They operated like predators who already knew where the prey would run. One Zero would act as bait, flying just above the cloud layer, slow and inviting, a wounded bird for the taking. When an American pilot fell for the illusion and dove to strike, two more Zeros would drop from above or from the sun's glare, cutting off his escape. In a matter of seconds, what looked like a hunt became an ambush. To the young men of the Army, Air Forces and the Navy, boys barely 20 years old, some fresh from training fields in Arizona, these tactics were not just frightening, they were humiliating. They had been taught that courage and precision could overcome any enemy. But in the Pacific, courage meant little against a machine that could quite literally turn circles around you. The P-38 Lightning, with its twin engines and brutal firepower, was powerful but unwieldy. The F-4F Wildcat could take damage, yes, but it rolled slowly, turning like a drunkard in the wind. The P-40 Warhawk had muscle, but its altitude performance was poor. In the high, thin air where the Zeros thrived, it felt like dragging a stone through water. Every aircraft had its strength, but none had the agility to fight on equal terms. And that realization, that quiet, dawning horror that skill and discipline might not be enough, began to haunt the ready rooms and briefing tents scattered across the islands of the South Pacific. Pilots wrote letters home describing the sky not as a place of glory, but as a chessboard where every move had already been predicted by an unseen opponent. They spoke of their enemies with something close to admiration, and of their own aircraft with reluctant frustration. Each new engagement seemed to prove the same cruel truth. The Americans had entered a war of attrition, while the Japanese were fighting a war of perfection. The statistics told the rest of the story. In 1942, in some sectors, Japanese pilots were achieving kill ratios of 3-to-1, meaning that for every Zero shot down, 3 Allied planes fell burning into the sea. For a pilot strapped into a cockpit made of thin aluminum and hope, those odds weren't just numbers, they were a countdown. And so the men began to improvise. They broke rules, ignored training, and gambled with the limits of their machines, not because they wanted to, but because the sky left them no other choice. In those chaotic, smoke-streaked months, the war was teaching them a brutal new truth about survival, that sometimes the difference between living and dying wasn't written in manuals, but discovered in panic, in blood, and in the thin air between instinct and insanity. That was the crucible from which a strange, reckless idea would emerge, the idea that if the Zero ruled the sky when upright, perhaps victory could only be found by turning the world completely upside down. The first time Lieutenant Richard Bong rolled his P-38 Lightning completely upside down, it wasn't a tactic. It was panic disguised as instinct. 3 Japanese Zeros were hunting him over the Solomon Islands. closing fast, and the world outside his canopy had become a whirlpool of tracer fire and sunlight. There was no time for reason, no room for careful geometry, just the animal awareness that something had to change now, or he would vanish into the sea like so many others before him. He did what no instructor had ever told him to do. He flipped his entire aircraft inverted, the Pacific flashing above his head, the sun now a blinding white below his feet, and yanked the control column forward, not backward, plunging the Lightning into an impossible dive. It defied every law of aerial combat, every page of every manual, every warning printed in red ink back at the training fields of Arizona and California. Negative G-flight was forbidden, not because it was difficult, but because it was suicidal. Instructors repeated the same rule like a prayer. Never pull forward when inverted. Never push your blood toward your brain. But combat had rewritten the rules. In those seconds of freefall, Bong's body discovered what scientists and engineers had only guessed at from the comfort of laboratories. The human body, when inverted under negative acceleration, becomes its own worst enemy. Blood that normally drains from the head is instead forced upward, filling the vessels behind the eyes, pounding at the temples, pressing against the fragile membranes of the brain itself. Vision blurs first, then reddens, until the world collapses into a narrow, pulsating crimson tunnel. It's called redout, and in 1943 no one in American aviation medicine had ever studied it under combat conditions. Inside Bong's cockpit, his vision darkened at the edges. The horizon disappeared. He couldn't read his instruments. He couldn't even tell if he was alive or dead, only that gravity had flipped and the Pacific was somewhere below him, roaring closer every second. The pain was indescribable, a weight pressing upward through the skull, a kind of reverse, drowning in blood. But then, just as suddenly, the sensation eased. The world righted itself. He rolled level again, gasping, his face flushed and his eyes burning, and the Zero that had been seconds from firing was gone, overshooting, climbing helplessly into empty sky. He had survived, not through training, but through accident, and that accident, that blind plunge into the impossible, would soon spread like a secret across the Pacific. A few weeks later, in another corner of that vast ocean, Major Thomas Lynch would take the same madness and make it deliberate. Flying his P-38 out of Port Moresby in April 1943, he led a patrol of 4 Lightnings at 20,000 feet when they ran headlong into a formation of 8 Zeros. In the chaos that followed, one of the Zeros dropped in behind him, closing fast. Lynch didn't climb. He didn't turn. He didn't even flinch. He simply rolled his aircraft inverted and pushed. His body slammed against the shoulder straps as the blood rushed to his head. The pressure was blinding, the noise of the engines deafening, the controls vibrating in his hands. He couldn't see, but he didn't need to. He felt the dive angle, trusting muscle memory and instinct to keep the Lightning from breaking apart. When his vision cleared, he was at 8,000 feet, the airspeed indicator showing more than 400 miles per hour. And the Zero that had been chasing him was nowhere in sight. The Japanese pilot had tried to follow, but his aircraft couldn't take it. The Zero's delicate frame, its ultralight wings and carbureted engine, had betrayed it. Under negative G, its fuel system coughed, the propeller sputtered, and the airframe began to shudder from the stress. He had been forced to level out early, and in that instant Lynch had not only escaped, but had gained the upper hand. He climbed back into the fight from below, re-entering the fray with speed and altitude on his side, and shot down 2 Zeros in quick succession. When he landed, his ground crew noticed the blood in the whites of his eyes, the tremor in his hands, the dazed look of a man who had stared through the edge of consciousness. But he was smiling. He had found something new, something that worked. That night, in the humid air of the mess tent, he explained it to the others as simply as he could. He picked up a spoon and turned it upside down. "If a Zero gets on your tail," he said, "you roll over and dive like this. Hard. Don't think about it. Don't fight it. Just go down fast enough that he can't follow. The bastard can't handle it. His plane will shake itself to pieces before you do." It wasn't science. It was survival. And like most discoveries born of desperation, it spread not through reports or diagrams, but through whispers. Within weeks, pilots across the Southwest Pacific were trying the maneuver for themselves, some cautiously, some recklessly. They called it different things: a split S, a negative push, a roll and dive. But the meaning was the same. If you found yourself trapped, if a zero was closing in and every textbook maneuver had failed, you inverted, pushed the stick forward and dove for your life. The engineers back home had built the P-38 with twin engines that could survive brief negative G loads, a quirk of design that no one had thought would ever matter. Unlike carbureted single-engine fighters, the Lightning's fuel injection systems didn't cut out when inverted, and that small detail, buried in the mechanical blueprints of a Lockheed manual, had now become the difference between death and survival. Pilots who used the new maneuver often landed with broken blood vessels in their faces, headaches that lasted for hours, and eyes so bloodshot they looked possessed. But they landed. Their friends who tried to fight conventionally did not. The contrast was brutal and undeniable. Negative G flight hurt, but it didn't kill you, and as one pilot later put it in a debriefing, "I'd rather come home with a migraine than be fish food in the Bismarck Sea." By the summer of 1943, this forbidden trick had become the worst-kept secret in the Pacific. It wasn't sanctioned, it wasn't in the manuals, it wasn't even officially named. But every experienced pilot quietly passed it down to the newcomers, in hangars, over beer, between missions, often with the same hushed tone soldiers use when sharing something sacred and dangerous. The unwritten rule was simple. If a zero locks onto your tail and there's nowhere left to go, don't fight him in the turn, don't try to climb. Just roll over, push forward, and let gravity do the killing for you. And in the process, the American pilots discovered something their instructors never could, that survival, in the chaotic and unforgiving geometry of aerial war, sometimes required turning the world completely upside down and trusting your body to endure what the textbooks swore it couldn't. No manual had ever prepared a man for what it actually felt like to fly upside down toward the ocean at 400 miles an hour, blind, deaf, and half-conscious. On paper, negative G flight was a matter of numbers: 2 Gs, 3 Gs, minus this, plus that, a sterile calculation about blood pressure and acceleration. But in the cockpit, in the thin, burning air above the Pacific, it became something else entirely, a form of controlled self-torture that separated those who could command their fear from those who were devoured by it. When a pilot rolled, inverted, and pushed the control column forward, the body revolted instantly. Every instinct screamed to stop, to pull back, to undo the unnatural act of diving toward the sea while staring at the sky. The stomach rose into the chest, the heart seemed to leap into the throat, and then came the pressure, a tremendous, swelling internal weight that flooded upward, crushing the sinuses and pounding against the eyes. Vision narrowed, colours bled together, and within a second or two the world turned the colour of fresh blood. That phenomenon, the dreaded red-out, was something aviation doctors had written about but never truly understood. The blood vessels in the eyes and temples, unable to drain properly, filled until they bulged and sometimes burst. The brain swam in a sudden tide of oxygen-rich fluid that hammered at the skull like a second heartbeat. Instructors back in the States had said that humans could only endure 2 seconds of such stress before losing consciousness. They were wrong. In the crucible of combat, pilots discovered that the body could take far more punishment than science dared to imagine, provided the mind refused to surrender. After those first terrible seconds, the red faded to darkness, and then the darkness thinned to grey. Somewhere in that haze, vision returned, and with it the cold, mechanical awareness of airspeed, altitude, and attitude. The pilot would level out just above the cloud deck, his chest heaving, his head pulsing, the cabin spinning slightly. He was alive, and he had done the impossible. When they landed, the evidence of what their bodies had endured was written plainly on their faces. Flight surgeons on Guadalcanal and New Guinea began keeping informal notes about the strange, bloody aftermath of these inverted dives. Captain James Moorhead, a flight doctor at Henderson Field, examined dozens of pilots who had survived encounters with Zeros using the new tactic. Almost all of them showed the same signs: a mask of ruptured capillaries scattered across the skin like freckles of blood, eyes so red they looked as though they had been crying tears of iron, and expressions that hovered somewhere between triumph and exhaustion. Some men stumbled out of their cockpits dizzy, unable to focus their eyes for minutes at a time. Others suffered pounding headaches that lasted through the night. One pilot described the sensation as like having your skull filled with boiling water. But the most remarkable discovery was that these injuries, terrifying as they looked, healed quickly. Within a day or two, the red blotches faded, the eyes cleared, the headaches dulled. There were no lasting effects. The price of survival was pain, but only for a few hours, and so the pilots accepted it, the way soldiers accept blisters on a march or burns from gunpowder. Just another tax collected by the machinery of war. Still, the danger was real. During those 2 or 3 seconds of red out, the pilot was blind. He couldn't see his altimeter, couldn't read his airspeed, couldn't tell where the horizon was. He was flying by touch, by instinct, by the memory of where the controls had been a heartbeat earlier, and sometimes that margin of error was enough to kill him. In training flights, several young pilots tried to copy the maneuver too low, beginning their roll at 5,000 or 6,000 feet instead of 10 or 12. They pushed forward, lost vision, and never recovered. From the ground, observers saw only a silver streak vanishing into the sea, followed by a faint plume of white spray and silence. After that, an unwritten rule circulated among the veterans. Never go inverted below 8,000 feet unless you're already dead. The numbers were grimly simple. Above 8,000 feet, the dive could be corrected. Below that, the mathematics turned fatal. But in the frenzy of combat, where the distance between 8,000 and 5,000 feet could vanish in less than 3 seconds, theory meant little. A pilot didn't think about equations. He thought about the bullets slicing past his canopy, the rising temperature in the cockpit, the sound of a voice on the radio that might already belong to a ghost. For those who lived through it, the body adapted faster than the mind. The second time a pilot went inverted, he knew what to expect. The sudden reversal of gravity, the explosion of blood behind the eyes, the 2 seconds of blindness. By the 3rd or 4th time, the fear remained, but it was no longer paralyzing. It became part of the rhythm of combat, like the shriek of anti-aircraft fire or the jolt of landing gear striking a rough island runway. They learned to tense their facial muscles, to clench the jaw, to force blood away from the head for a heartbeat longer. Some even discovered that by easing off the stick, trading a little speed for a little sight, they could shorten the red out to a flicker. Every pilot developed his own version of the trick, shaped by instinct and desperation. They were no longer following doctrine, they were rewriting it with every heartbeat. Each man who survived brought back a small, painful lesson. How much the body could endure, how far the aircraft could bend before breaking, how close death could pass without quite reaching out its hand. And somewhere between terror and adaptation, between pain and survival, the impossible maneuver became routine. It stopped being madness. It became muscle memory, an act of faith performed in steel and blood. By late 1943, the sight of a P-38 or a Corsair suddenly rolling, inverted in the middle of combat, no longer shocked anyone. The maneuver that had once seemed suicidal was now accepted as something grimly practical, like biting down on a bullet during surgery. It was brutal, it was ugly, but it worked, and in the strange arithmetic of war, that was all that mattered. It began quietly, not in a briefing room or a classroom or some antiseptic flight school on the coast of California, but in the half-light of a jungle airfield, somewhere in the steaming Pacific dusk, where men in oil-stained flight suits sat on ammunition crates and spoke to each other in low, tired voices about the things that actually kept them alive. There were no chalkboards, no diagrams, no officers with pointers. There were just gestures in the air, the curve of a hand, the twist of a wrist, and a few words repeated like a whispered prayer. Roll over, push forward, and don't look back until the red fades. That was how the inverted dive, the so-called Split S, began its quiet migration across the Pacific theatre. No one had authorized it. No one had written it into a manual. But the men who returned from missions with their faces bruised and their eyes bloodshot carried something far more persuasive than a regulation. They carried proof. Proof that if you ignored everything you had been taught, if you defied gravity and reason and the official gospel of flight, you might just come home. The idea spread the way all forbidden truth spread, through rumor, through demonstration, through the unspoken language of those who had seen death and tricked it once. At the edge of airstrips carved out of jungle, beneath the flickering glow of Coleman lamps, veterans would gather the new arrivals and explain it as best they could, not in technical terms, but in survival terms. They would say, if a Zero slides in behind you and you feel that hot needle of panic between your shoulder blades, don't climb, don't turn, that's what he wants. Instead, flip your ship upside down and dive so hard your teeth rattle. You won't see anything for 2 seconds, maybe 3, but if you come out of it alive, you'll have the speed. And he won't. It sounded insane. And it was. But insanity had begun to look an awful lot like wisdom. Even squadron commanders, the men responsible for enforcing doctrine, learned to look the other way. They understood that war had a logic of its own, one that could not be captured in a typed memorandum. Officially, the maneuver didn't exist. Unofficially, it was saving lives every single week. By the middle of 1943, pilots of the 49th and 475th Fighter Groups, the hard-flying, sunburned men who lived in tents on Guadalcanal and Moresby and the Russell Islands, were all using it, each with his own small variation. Some rolled gently to keep a sliver of vision, some dove almost vertically for speed, some even used the maneuver offensively, turning the escape into a sudden counterattack. When replacement pilots arrived fresh from training, their education began not with a lecture but with a demonstration. The veterans would take them up in the thin morning light, roll the plane over and show them what courage really felt like, when it pressed blood into your eyes and roared in your ears like the sea. The Air Force didn't record those lessons. There were no official documents, no training films, no signatures on dotted lines. Only the stories, passed from mouth to mouth, carried on the humid wind through the endless archipelago of war. Stories of men who should have died but didn't, who went blind in the dive but woke up alive on the other side of it. The brass called it reckless. The pilots called it math that worked. And gradually, the numbers began to shift. Where once the Japanese had claimed kill ratios of 3 to 1, by late 1943 the balance was beginning to even out. The same Zeros that had once ruled the sky found themselves baffled by opponents who no longer played by the rules. The Americans no longer tried to outturn them or outdance them. Instead, they vanished downward like stones, leaving the Japanese pilots clawing after them in aircraft that were never built for negative G flight. Engines coughed, wings trembled, fuel lines starved. The pursuer, trying to follow through the dive, found his controls stiffening, his vision blurring, and sometimes, if he pressed too far, his plane disintegrating mid-air in a cloud of shattered aluminum. From the ground, it must have looked like madness, these American planes flipping belly up and plunging toward the sea, only to reappear seconds later, level and alive, streaking back into the fight. But up in the cockpit, it didn't feel like madness. It felt like reclaiming the sky. Pilots began to talk about the vertical, not the horizontal. They started to think in 3 dimensions, to treat the air not as a flat battlefield, but as a vast, layered ocean, where survival depended on knowing when to dive and when to rise. The Zero ruled the circle, yes, but the Lightning, the Corsair, and the Thunderbolt ruled the spiral. And in that spiral, the Americans found their salvation. Colonel Neil Kirby of the 348 Fighter Group, a tall, hard-spoken man who flew the heavy P-47 Thunderbolt, put it bluntly to his men, "If you try to turn with a Zero, you'll die. But if you dive, you'll live long enough to kill him tomorrow." Under Kirby's command, the Split S wasn't an accident anymore. It became a philosophy, a kind of ritualized defiance against both the enemy and the textbook. The Thunderbolt, huge and unwieldy, could dive faster than almost anything in the sky, and Kirby taught his men to use that mass as a weapon. Drop inverted, ride the fall, feel the skin of the plane shudder, and let the storm of physics drag you out of the enemy's reach. His squadron began returning from missions with higher survival rates than any in the region. The higher command didn't understand why. Kirby didn't bother to explain. By late 1943 and into early 1944, even the Marine Corsair squadrons operating from the island bases of Munda and Vella La Vella had adopted the technique. The F-4U, with its huge propeller and powerful radial engine, could dive like a stone and come up grinning. Major Robert Gaylor of the Black Sheep Squadron demonstrated the inverted dive so many times for his men that it became part of their unofficial syllabus. He told them the same thing Lynch had told his Lightning pilots a year before. It's not a trick, it's a door, and you open it only when you have no other way out. The beauty of it, if war can ever be said to have beauty, was its quiet anarchy. No general invented it, no committee approved it, no engineer designed it. It was born from the same elemental instinct that had once taught sailors to reef sails in a storm, or soldiers to dig trenches in the mud, the raw, unteachable desire to keep breathing. And so, across the scattered islands and rain-soaked runways of the South Pacific, a strange brotherhood emerged, a network of men bound not by regulation but by experience, who understood that sometimes the only way to master gravity was to surrender to it. They were young, often terrified, usually exhausted, but they were learning something that even science had failed to grasp, that survival was not about strength or speed or courage, but about knowing when to turn the world upside down and trust the fall. The command staff at 5th Air Force Headquarters, thousands of miles away, continued to issue memos about standardized defensive tactics and approved combat protocols, unaware that the pilots under their command had quietly staged a revolution. They had rewritten the language of air combat without ever lifting a pen. By the time anyone noticed, it was too late to stop it. The maneuver had become a fact of war, not because anyone had ordered it, but because reality had demanded it. And in that gap between the official record and the unwritten truth, between the polished bullet points of strategy and the blood-spattered improvisations of survival, something profoundly human had taken root, the eternal whisper that echoes through every battlefield, from the trenches to the stratosphere. If the rule is killing you, break it. By the time the war reached its final, burning chapters in late 1944, the inverted dive was no longer an accident whispered about in jungle tents. It had become a quiet standard, a piece of unspoken doctrine that every veteran carried in his hands and in his blood, a secret that needed no signature or approval, because it had already been proven 1,000 times over in the only courtroom that mattered, the sky. From the decks of the USS Essex and Lexington to the scattered airfields of the Philippines and New Guinea, pilots were now teaching it as part of their survival catechism. The final prayer, you said, when every other tactic had failed, when death had already begun its descent behind you. The instructors no longer warned about negative G-stress or retinal damage. They simply said, if you're going to die anyway, die upside down trying not to. And in that single defiant sentence, the distance between training and reality collapsed. The Japanese, for their part, began to notice. By late 1943 and early 1944, reports from Zero pilots spoke with confusion and disbelief about American aircraft suddenly rolling inverted and plunging toward the sea, only to reappear seconds later far below, climbing again with impossible speed. They thought it was cowardice at first, a retreat, a refusal to engage. But what they didn't yet realize was that these Americans weren't running away. They were resetting the fight. They were rewriting the rhythm of combat. Some Japanese pilots tried to follow through the inverted dives, but the Zero, that miraculous bird of the early war, had been designed for another kind of fight, for the elegant horizontal dance of turning duels and graceful climbs, not for the brutal vertical geometry of modern combat. Its frame, so delicate and so precise, began to tremble when forced through negative Gs. Fuel lines coughed, engines sputtered, control surfaces fluttered like dying wings, and when they tried to match the Americans' plunging dives, they discovered, to their horror, that physics had finally turned against them. Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Maguire, flying a P-38 in December of 1944 over Leyte Gulf, recorded one such encounter. 4 Zeros had attacked his formation from above. One managed to line up perfectly behind him, the tracer fire flashing past his canopy like sparks from a forge. Maguire rolled, inverted and dove, straight into the blinding sunlit haze below. The Zero followed, for a moment, but as Maguire's twin engines roared past 450 miles per hour, the pursuing aircraft began to shake, its thin skin vibrating so violently but the pilot was forced to pull out early. Maguire levelled off at 6,000 feet, looped upward in a graceful burning arc, and came up behind the same pilot who had been hunting him. 2 bursts, a trail of smoke. The hunter had become the hunted. That pattern would repeat again and again until the war's end. The Japanese, trapped by their own design philosophy, and the Americans, surviving through improvisation and pain. The Zero, once the terror of the Pacific, had become a relic of an earlier era, a reminder that perfection can be its own undoing when the world changes faster than you do. When peace finally came, and the pilots went home, those who still could, the maneuver they had invented in chaos followed them quietly into history. No medals were awarded for it. No one's name was carved into textbooks. It was not celebrated in parades or documentaries. It simply became. And yet, in ways invisible and profound, it transformed everything that came after. In the skies over Korea, in the biting cold above the Yalu River, F-86 Sabre pilots found themselves fighting a new enemy, the Soviet-built MiG-15, faster and higher flying, but every bit as nimble as the old Zero. And once again, American pilots discovered that when cornered, the answer was the same: roll over, push forward, and let gravity save you. Captain Joseph McConnell, who had become the top American ace of the Korean War, credited his life in multiple dogfights to what he called rolling out underneath them. He never used the term split S, but he didn't need to. The lineage was obvious. It was the same act of faith passed down across a decade and an ocean. And then came Vietnam, a different war, in a different age, fought with jets that screamed faster than sound, yet even there, in the humid, hostile skies of Southeast Asia, when the missiles failed and the radar broke, when combat narrowed once again to the human scale of reflex and terror, American pilots reverted to the same ancient instinct: invert, dive, reset, survive. The names had changed: MiG-7s, MiG-20s, Phantoms, Crusaders, but the principle remained the same. Physics had not changed, neither had fear. By the late 1960s, at Naval Air Station Miramar, when the United States Navy established its elite fighter weapons school, the one that would later become known to the world as Top Gun, the maneuver that had once been forbidden, unscientific and borderline suicidal, was now taught as standard defensive doctrine. They no longer called it the inverted dive. They called it the negative G pushover, or the unloaded roll. And the instructors, many of whom had grown up hearing stories from their fathers or uncles who'd fought in the Pacific, knew that this was no invention of their own. It was an inheritance, a fragment of ancestral memory passed down through generations of men who had learned again and again that survival sometimes meant trusting gravity more than training. In the sleek, computerized cockpits of the F-16, the F-A-18, and now the F-35, pilots still feel that same ancient pull when they invert. That surge of blood toward the skull, that pressure behind the eyes, that brief, suffocating red that fills the world for an instant. They train for it, they endure it, but somewhere deep inside, the instinct that drives them is not mechanical or procedural. It's human. It's the same pulse of fear and defiance that once throbbed in the temples of men like Bong and Lynch and Kirby, men who didn't have sensors or fly-by-wire systems, just courage, pain, and a machine that obeyed only as long as you commanded it harder than death did. What began as a desperate act of inversion has become a universal truth of flight, that sometimes the way out isn't up or around, but down, into the unthinkable. That sometimes the only way to survive is to let go of what you've been taught, turn the world upside down, and trust the fall to deliver you safely back into the light. And so, though their names rarely appear in the textbooks of aviation, the ghosts of those Pacific pilots still haunt every flight deck, every simulator, every training sortie that ends with a young man or woman rolling inverted and diving into the unknown. They live in the muscle memory of those who came after, the ones who learned to face fear not by avoiding it, but by flying straight through it. Their legacy isn't measured in medals or monuments. It lives in the quiet, continuous heartbeat of every fighter engine that dares to defy the sky. Because even now, 80 years later, Every time a pilot inverts his aircraft and feels that brief, terrible rush of blood to the head, every time the horizon turns upside down and the world vanishes in red, he is in some small way flying alongside them. Even when the last of the piston engines fell silent and the age of jets erased the thunder of propellers from the air, the spirit of those early Pacific dogfights never truly vanished. It lingered in the very architecture of the sky, in the quiet mathematics of lift and gravity that every new generation of pilots inherited without even knowing from whom. Every maneuver taught in the bright digital classrooms of the 21st century, every simulated roll, every evasive dive, carries within it the ghost of that first forbidden push, that first upside-down heartbeat, when Richard Bong and Thomas Lynch trusted something far older than training, the instinct to live, no matter what it cost. Modern pilots now fly wrapped in layers of computers and sensors, their helmets glowing with data, their aircraft whispering warnings before the body ever feels danger. And yet, at the core of every emergency procedure, at the center of every last resort escape sequence, there remains that same raw command that has survived wars, generations and revolutions in technology: invert and fall. Because in the language of flight, falling is not always failure. Sometimes it is survival written in reverse. At Top Gun and Red Flag, instructors still speak of negative G tolerance, of centrifuge tests, of controlled readout exposure. The students nod, take notes, memorize the limits. But what cannot be taught, what cannot be reduced to numbers, is the silence that comes in those 2 or 3 seconds when the world turns crimson and the instruments vanish, and a pilot must rely on nothing except faith in his own hands. That moment is timeless. It feels exactly as it did over the Solomon Islands in 1943, and it will feel the same 100 years from now, no matter how fast or sleek the aircraft becomes. Somewhere above the Nevada desert, or over the empty Atlantic during night training, a young pilot may one day find himself pushed too far, too low, too fast. A radar lock warning screaming in his ears, adrenaline flooding every nerve, and he will remember something that was never formally taught to him. Something passed through generations like a genetic echo: roll over, push forward, trust the fall. And when he does, when the horizon flips and the blood surges to his skull and the sky fills with that familiar red haze, the ghosts of the Pacific will rise once more to guide his hands. In those seconds of chaos, the war will return, not as sound or memory, but as instinct. The pilot will not think of Bong or Lynch or Kirby, but they will be there, their breath mingling with the oxygen hiss in his mask, their calm voices whispering from the long corridors of time. Every dive is a conversation with the dead. Every recovery is an answer to a question they asked 80 years ago. Can courage be taught, or is it born? When he levels out again, heart racing, vision clearing, engines steady, the world will look the same as it always does after surviving the impossible: smaller, brighter, quieter. He will exhale, check his gauges, maybe laugh in disbelief, and in that laugh will live the entire lineage of fighter pilots who learned that heroism isn't found in victory rolls or medals or headlines, but in those few trembling seconds when pain, fear, and reason all collapse into a single act of defiance. Because that, more than any weapon or engine or tactic, was what the Pacific War truly taught humanity. That survival is not just about strength or technology or numbers, but about the willingness to step beyond the limits of comfort and training, to enter the unknown head first, upside down and bleeding, and still find the discipline to keep flying straight. History often remembers the machines, the P-38 Lightning, the F-4U Corsair, the Zero, but the truth is, the machines were only vessels for something infinitely more mysterious. It was the human heart beating beneath a canvas flight suit that truly changed the rules of gravity. It was the trembling hand that dared to push instead of pull. It was the mind that, in a single flash of terror, discovered that the boundary between fear and genius is only 2 seconds wide, and so the sky remembers. Every contrail drawn against the morning light, every whisper of thunder at altitude, every gleaming silhouette inverted against the sun, they are all, in some quiet way, memorials to that revelation born over the Pacific. But sometimes the difference between falling and flying is not direction, but courage. In the end, when the engines are silent and the horizon fades into that endless blue where day dissolves into night, there remains only the faint hum of the earth turning below, and somewhere high above it, a memory that refuses to die. The sky, after all, never forgets the men who once bled into its light. It carries their echoes still, not in the roar of propellers or the chatter of machine guns, but in the soft, invisible tremor of wind over metal, the whisper of altitude that feels almost like prayer. There is something profoundly human about that, the way memory clings to air. Every generation forgets the details, the names, the ranks, the coordinates, but what endures is the shape of the act itself, a heartbeat of defiance against gravity, a refusal to surrender even when the world turns upside down. That is what those men left behind, not tactics, not diagrams, but a gesture so simple and so infinite that it outlived them. The roll, the push, the plunge, the rise. You can almost imagine them now, gliding above the Pacific, not as soldiers or aces, but as silhouettes of courage, their wings carving silent spirals into the dusk. Below them, the ocean mirrors the colour of their exhaustion, endless and merciful. They are young again, forever caught in that suspended moment between descent and ascent, between fear and freedom. The war is over. The world is quiet, but the air remembers. Somewhere, perhaps over Nevada or Okinawa or a nameless patch of water, a modern pilot will someday roll his jet inverted and feel that sudden weight in his skull, that ancient pressure behind the eyes. And in that instant, though he may not know it, he will be sharing the same heartbeat as those men in 1943. It will not be history to him, but instinct. It will not be courage, but necessity. And for a brief, burning second, the line between past and present will blur, as though the ghosts of the Pacific have reached out across time to guide his hands through the storm. Because what they discovered all those years ago was not merely a tactic or a trick of survival. It was a truth about being human, about the fragile thread that ties reason to instinct, discipline to chaos, and life to death. They proved, without meaning to, that there is a kind of peace even in falling, that sometimes the only way through fear is into it, that sometimes the soul must invert itself to find balance. The story of the inverted dive, of the men who dared to defy gravity itself, is not just about flight or war or machines. It is about what happens when the world collapses into red light and noise, and a single decision determines whether you will see another sunrise. It is about the thin line between survival and surrender, between control and chaos, between the known and the unknowable. And so, as night settles over the ocean once more, and the last embers of daylight fade into the quiet hum of eternity, the sky remains the same as it was in 1943, vast, patient, indifferent, and waiting for the next heartbeat, the next pilot, the next impossible choice. Because the sky, like history, always demands the same answer, not bravery, not perfection, but the simple, unyielding will to keep flying, even when the world turns upside down. And perhaps that is why, when you look up at the faint trails of vapour crossing the evening sky, those thin white lines fading into the blue, you can almost hear them still. The whisper of propellers, the echo of a radio static, the laughter of men who dared to dive into oblivion and found for a moment a strange kind of grace waiting on the other side. For in the end, the sky remembers, even when we forget, that every act of falling, no matter how desperate or blind, is just another way of learning to rise. And so, when all the stories have been told, when the medals have dulled and the photographs have yellowed, when the world below has forgotten the names of the islands where young men once drew lines of fire in the air, there will still remain, high above the noise of civilization, that quiet kingdom where gravity and courage still argue about who owns the human heart. Because even now, in the hush between thunder and silence, the sky keeps its witnesses. There are no statues for those who learned to fly by breaking rules, no parades for the ones who went blind in red haze and came back with blood in their eyes. Their memorials are not carved in stone, but written in the invisible architecture of flight, hidden in the brief tremor of a fuselage as it rolls inverted, in the steady hand that refuses to pull up too soon, in the pulse of a heart that still believes in survival. Every generation of pilots carries it unknowingly, the inheritance of that single, reckless decision made over the Solomon Islands, the memory of one man choosing to fall instead of die. It moves through the bloodstream of aviation like a secret prayer. That instinct can be holy, that pain can be instruction, that even in the chaos of war there exists a quiet order discovered only by those who dared to let go. If you were to stand on a cliff at dusk and look toward the horizon where the ocean swallows the sun, you might see nothing at all, just sky and water, endless, indistinguishable. But if you could listen closely enough, you would hear the faintest echo, a whisper carried by the wind across 8 decades of distance. It would sound like engines fading, like a heartbeat between waves, and in that sound you might feel it, the pulse of every man who ever faced the impossible and pushed forward instead of back. Because the sky, for all its indifference, has always been faithful to memory. It holds every scream, every dive, every gasp of terror and wonder. It holds the ghosts not as burdens, but as part of its design, as threads woven into the air itself. And perhaps that is why flight will always feel sacred, why even the most advanced jet, surrounded by electronics and automation, still depends on the trembling courage of a single human pulse to guide it home. Long after the wars have ended, and the oceans have erased the wrecks, long after the airfields have turned to grass and the hangars to dust, the lesson remains, pure and unchanging, that sometimes survival requires inversion, of logic, of instinct, of fear itself. That to live, one must first be willing to fall. And so the cycle continues, generation after generation, new names, new machines, same gravity, same silence. Somewhere tonight, in the blackness above a foreign sea, a pilot will roll his aircraft upside down and feel, for a heartbeat, the old world return, the rush of blood, the blindness, the red flood of light. He will not know the names of those who came before him, but he will know their courage, because it will live in his hands. And when he pulls level again, when the stars realign and the world steadies itself beneath his wings, the echo will fade back into the wind, leaving behind only peace. History, in the end, is not a list of battles or machines or victories. It is the accumulation of small moments when fear met invention, when instinct refused to die. And high above the earth, where silence lives and memory never truly ends, those moments are still unfolding, written not in ink or stone, but in vapor and gravity, in courage and blood. So sleep now, under the same vast sky that watched them all, the pilots, the engineers, the dreamers, the forgotten, because somewhere above the soft hum of the night, the heavens are still turning, and the air is still whispering their names, not as heroes, not as soldiers, but as men who once looked death in the face and chose to fly upside down. Hey there, my friend. Tonight, you're not heading back to the trenches, but to a Europe still shaped by them. The war is over, the bugles have fallen silent, and the newspapers are full of bright headlines about peace and prosperity. Just not for you. You've come home with an injury that never quite healed. The streets are crowded, the cafes are noisy, and the world seems in a hurry to forget. In the early 1920s, there's no shortage of advice for men like you. Take a walk, get fresh air, try to sleep. And when none of that works, there's something new from the chemist's shelf, a small vial or packet prescribed with a smile that promises rest. They don't tell you how much you'll come to need it. Before we put that first dose in your hand and watch the city fade at the edges, please get comfortable. Now, lie back. Let's begin. You step off the train into a city you used to know, though the familiarity feels strangely academic now, as if you've studied it in photographs rather than lived here. The station's high roof is smudged with coal dust. The iron girders are streaked with old soot, and the air carries the mingled scent of steam, damp wool, and the faint tang of oil from the machinery that never really rests. Porters in worn caps weave between the passengers, their barrows piled with suitcases, parcels, and the odd wooden trunk marked with names that might never be claimed. The weight of your kit bag pulls at your right shoulder, sending a dull ache down your back, the same one you've carried since the shell fragment was dug out in a field hospital years ago. Outside the arched doors, the streets are wet from a recent rain, the paving stones reflecting the grey sky above, each puddle shivering when a motorcar rattles past. You've imagined this moment more times than you care to admit, the moment you came home, left the war behind and walked once more among people not dressed in khaki. But it is already clear that you've come back to a place that does not quite exist anymore. The first thing you notice is the quiet absence of certain faces. They are not here to meet you on the platform, nor are they anywhere in the crowd. Some you know for certain will not return. Their names already carved into fresh stone in the churchyard, or listed on the bronze plaques bolted to civic buildings. Others simply disappeared into the cracks of peace, moved away, married, found work elsewhere, or in some cases taken to avoiding former comrades entirely. The war has scattered people like leaves in wind, and you realize there is no regathering them. What remains in their place are strangers with hurried steps, their eyes skimming past yours, too polite or too cautious to stare at the way you walk or at the old service tunic you still wear, because you haven't yet replaced it. A few men pass you on crutches, their trousers pinned where a leg should be, while others stand outside shop fronts with tin cups at their feet, eyes downcast, their uniforms patched and fraying at the seams. These are the ones who couldn't fit themselves back into the clockwork of civilian life, and for the first time you suspect you might be one of them. You walk through streets that should be reassuring in their ordinariness. The rows of brick terraces, the chimneys, the public houses with their frosted windows. But every corner seems touched by the war. Posters still cling to walls and faded strips, urging men to enlist or civilians to buy bonds. The painted lettering is peeling now, the bright colours dulled to the colour of dust, but the slogans remain legible if you care to look. In shop windows, mannequins wear suits cut from cloth far finer than anything you've had in years, and their faces, blank and serene, seem almost smug in their detachment from the grit and cold outside. You think of the shops in towns you passed through during the war, their fronts blasted in, the mannequins half buried in rubble, and the memory sits like a stone in your chest. Peace, it seems, hasn't removed the contrast between those who have and those who have not. It has only sharpened it. By the time you reach the street where you'll be staying, the afternoon has already begun to lean toward evening. You've chosen a boarding house because it's cheaper than a hotel and less lonely than a rented flat, at least in theory. The building is narrow, squeezed between a greengrocer's with a slanted awning and a small shop that smells faintly of turpentine. Its door is painted a weary green, the brass knocker tarnished to a dull brown. Inside, the hallway is dim, lit by a single wall lamp that flickers when the wind pushes against the windows. The landlady, a woman of indeterminate age with arms like broom handles, shows you to your room without ceremony. She points out the shared washroom down the hall, mentions the rules about visitors, and tells you when breakfast is served. Her voice is brisk, efficient, the same tone used for every tenant, and you suspect that if you collapsed on the floor, she would step around you to dust the skirting boards. Your room is small, but not uncomfortable. A narrow bed against one wall, a chest of drawers with a cracked mirror on top, a table just big enough for a chair and a lamp. The wallpaper is patterned with faded vines and the occasional water stain. The floorboards creak when you cross them. There is no fire in the grate. Coal costs more now than it did before the war, and the landlady is careful with her supply. But you've known colder nights in worse places. The climb up the narrow staircase made the pain flare again, a steady line of heat along your spine that only eases once you set your kit bag down. You stand for a moment in the middle of the room, listening to the muffled sound of voices from the street below, the hiss of a passing tram, the uneven ticking of the clock in the hall. It is, you remind yourself, a place to sleep, a place to start again. Sleep, however, is not a thing you've been able to summon on command in years. The war taught your body to stay alert to every sound, every shift in the air, every flicker of movement at the edge of sight. Even here, with no gunfire, no shouting orders, no sudden concussion of shells, You find yourself half waiting for something to happen. You unpack slowly, folding shirts into the drawer, placing your shaving kit on the washstand. That night, you take a walk after the lamps are lit. The city is busier after dark, the cafes and public houses glowing with yellow light, the windows hazed with steam from kitchens and the breath of patrons. In one doorway, a man plays a violin, the notes curling through the air like smoke. Across the street, a group of young women in cloche hats laugh as they pass, the click of their heels sharp against the pavement. You feel both part of it and apart from it, like an extra in a scene meant for someone else's story. The people here are living in a present tense you can't quite manage. Your mind still circles back to fields, to mud, to the slow minutes between bombardments. The war has loosened its grip on the world, but it has not yet loosened its grip on you. When you return to the boarding house, the hallway is quiet. A smell of boiled cabbage lingers from supper, clinging to the wallpaper. Upstairs, a door slams, followed by the sound of boots being kicked off, but otherwise the building might be empty. You wash up in the shared room down the hall, the cold water shocking against your skin, and make your way back to your own. Outside, a tram clatters past, its bell a brief bright interruption in the night. You undress slowly, folding your clothes into a neat pile on the chair, and sit on the edge of the bed for a moment, elbows on your knees, head bowed. The mattress dips under your weight as you lie back, staring up at the ceiling. The plaster has a fine crack running from the corner to the centre, branching like a river on a map. You follow it with your eyes again and again, as though tracing its roots might tell you where you are meant to go next. The bed is quiet beneath you, the pillow thin but serviceable, the blankets heavy enough to keep out the draught from the window. Yet sleep will not come. The body is still, but the mind refuses to rest, tugging you toward places and moments you thought you'd left behind. Somewhere in the building, a clock chimes the hour, the sound soft and distant, marking the slow passage of a night that will be long before it is over. The night passes in fragments, each hour strung with stretches of half-sleep and abrupt awakenings. By the time the first thin light seeps between the curtains, your eyes feel gritty and your limbs heavy. The pain in your back has spread into your legs, a dull, deep pressure that kept you shifting in bed all night. It isn't sharp enough to double you over, but it gnaws steadily at the edges of your patience, and you know from experience it won't pass on its own. You dress slowly, pulling on the same trousers and jacket you wore yesterday, and descend the stairs to find the boarding house quiet, except for the faint clink of crockery from the kitchen. The landlady nods at you without much warmth when you pass, already busy with the business of boiling water for tea. Outside, the air is damp and the clouds hang low enough to make the city seem smaller. You have nowhere in particular to go, but your body is telling you something different, that the pain will not politely wait its turn to be ignored. The decision to see a doctor is not made out of sudden urgency so much as a weary concession. You have endured worse weeks in field hospitals, where the smell of disinfectant barely masked the stink of blood and infection, where the groans of the wounded carried through the night. But those were different times when there was no alternative, when discomfort was simply part of the uniform. Now, in peacetime, there are expectations. People talk about getting on, as though it were a skill you could master with enough determination. But no one seems to acknowledge that the body has its own say in the matter. You find a surgery not far from the station, its brass plaque dulled by rain, the name etched in neat serif letters. A doctor who has likely been here since before the war, serving the same patient list with the same prescriptions. The waiting room is small and dim, lined with wooden chairs polished by years of use. A coal fire snaps faintly in the grate, giving off more smoke than heat. Two women sit near the window, one with a bundled child asleep against her shoulder. The other stares out at the street, her gloved hands folded tightly in her lap. A clock ticks somewhere out of sight, slow and deliberate. When your turn comes, the doctor ushers you in with a brief nod. He's a man in his 50s, perhaps older, his hair gone to iron grey at the temples. His desk is neatly arranged, the inkwell and blotter positioned just so, a small glass jar of boiled sweets within reach of his right hand. He listens without interruption as you describe the trouble. The pain in your back from where a shell fragment once lodged and was removed. The stiffness in your legs after a day's walking. The way sleep comes in snatches, chased away by dreams that feel more real than the room around you. He doesn't question whether the pain is genuine. Perhaps the slight slump of your shoulders or the careful way you lower yourself into the chair is evidence enough. Instead, he opens a drawer and produces a small cardboard box, the kind used for tablets. The label is printed in bold black type, the name of the preparation long and faintly chemical, but one word stands out: heroin. You've heard the term before, in barracks, in hospital wards, whispered by orderlies or mentioned in passing by officers who had been dosed for some injury or another. It is, the doctor explains, a recent advancement, a refined, dependable derivative of morphine, faster acting, more effective, less habit-forming, or so the literature claims. His tone is the careful neutrality of a man repeating the phrasing supplied by the manufacturer. He tells you he can give you a single injection now, just to ease the worst of it, and then prescribe tablets for you to take in the days ahead. The words safe and modern pass his lips as if they were part of the same thought. You agree, not from any particular trust in the method, but from a vague desire to have it over with. He draws the dose into a syringe, the glass barrel catching the thin light from the window. The sight makes your stomach shift, though you've seen far worse in battlefield stations. The prick of the needle is brief, the push of the plunger slow and deliberate. He speaks in a low, steady voice as he works, though the words themselves slip past you. The warmth begins almost at once, starting in the arm and moving inward, as if someone had poured heated water into your veins. It is not the sharp, dizzying rush you half expected. Instead, it is a slow unfurling, a loosening of knots you didn't realize you'd been holding tight. The ache in your back recedes first, fading into something distant and untroubling. The stiffness in your legs follows, the muscles softening, the joints no longer catching when you shift your weight. Even the tension behind your eyes, the tired, clenched feeling that has lived there since the day you stepped off the transport ship, begins to ease. The doctor makes a note in his ledger, then gives you a supply of tablets. He tells you the dosage, the intervals, the signs that might mean you've taken too much. There is no mention of dependency, no warning about the length of use, only a faint reminder to return if the symptoms persist. When you leave the surgery, the street seems brighter, though the clouds have not shifted. The wet pavement gleams underfoot, and the air feels cleaner somehow, as though the rain has washed away more than just the grime. The pain has not merely diminished. It has been replaced by a curious lightness, a sense of your body moving without resistance. Steps that would normally send a twinge through your side now pass without notice. You find yourself walking without thinking about the mechanics of it, without anticipating the next spasm or tightening. The realization is almost disorienting. You have been living inside a shell of discomfort for so long that its absence feels unnatural. You stop in a small cafe on the corner, drawn in by the warmth and the smell of coffee. The tables are close together, their surfaces scratched and worn, the chairs mismatched but sturdy. A woman behind the counter pours coffee from a tall metal pot, the steam curling toward the ceiling. You sit near the window, watching the passers-by. For the first time in recent memory, the movement of the crowd does not set your nerves on edge. The clatter of cups, the scrape of chairs, the murmur of voices, all of it folds into the background without triggering the sense that something is about to happen. It is as if the volume of the world has been turned down to a tolerable level. You drink the coffee slowly, the warmth of it pooling in your chest. Outside, a tram rattles past, trailing a brief haze of smoke. The thought occurs to you that perhaps this, the simple act of sitting in a cafe without pain or unease, is what people mean when they talk about recovery. You imagine walking home, sleeping through the night without waking in a sweat, rising in the morning with limbs that move freely. It feels almost plausible, and the sensation is intoxicating in its own quiet way. When the cup is empty, you linger a moment longer before stepping back into the street. The boarding house looks unchanged when you return, its green-painted door still dull in the fading light. Inside, the hallway smells faintly of cold dust and boiled vegetables, the sounds of supper preparation drifting from the kitchen. You climb the stairs without the usual effort, pausing only when the creak of the floorboards reminds you where you are. In your room, the air is cool but not uncomfortable. The warmth from the injection lingers in your limbs, humming faintly under the skin, and for the next few hours you move without the usual careful calculations that have become second nature. Standing, bending, turning, all those movements you once plotted out like a slow dance to avoid the spike of pain now pass without a second thought. It is almost alarming, the absence of that constant low warning in the back of your mind, but the feeling is too pleasant for you to dwell on the strangeness. You sit for a time by the window, watching the street below. People pass without hurry. The trams rattle by with their usual metallic complaint, and somewhere further down the street, a barrel organ plays a song you half recognize from before the war. The music is faint and a little sour in tone, but it still manages to loosen something in your chest. You think of the years when standing at a window like this would have been impossible, the stiffness setting in after only a few minutes, the nagging pull along your spine, and you find yourself leaning forward without hesitation, elbows braced on the sill, the air cool against your face. But as the afternoon turns toward evening, the borrowed ease begins to thin. The stiffness in your back creeps back into place like a house guest, who stepped outside for a moment and returned without knocking. It isn't immediate, nor is it sharp enough to force you to stop what you're doing, but it grows steadily, settling into the familiar lines of muscle and bone. You shift in the chair, trying to stretch it out, but the relief is fleeting. By the time you've finished the small supper the landlady provides, boiled potatoes, a scrap of meat, a ladle of overcooked cabbage, there's a tightness in your legs again, and a faint pressure in your lower spine that tells you exactly where this is headed. The packet sits on the table where you left it. The doctor's handwriting is neat but brisk, the kind of script that assumes you already understand the instructions. Dosage, intervals, as needed. You turn it over in your hand for a long moment before unfolding it, the paper crackling softly in the quiet room. The tablets inside are small, chalky to the touch, giving off only the faintest medicinal scent. You tip one into your palm and swallow it with a mouthful of cold water from the jug on the washstand, the bitterness lingering briefly at the back of your throat. The change comes slowly, not the instant bloom of warmth from the injection, but a gradual unwinding that works its way outward from the center of you. The pressure along your spine eases, the muscles in your legs relax, and that tight, watchful feeling in your head fades until the room seems softer somehow, as though the edges of things have been sanded smooth. You undress without wincing at the stretch of fabric across your shoulders, slide between the blankets, and feel your body settle as though it has been waiting for this exact position all day. Sleep arrives without negotiation. No staring at the ceiling, no restless shifting, no sudden flares of memory breaking through the thin membrane between wakefulness and dream. You sink, and the hours pass in a dark, steady current that carries you all the way to morning without a single break. When you open your eyes, the light is already pressing at the curtains. You lie still for a moment, listening to the muted sound of a tram bell outside, and register the absence before anything else. No pain in your back, no stiffness in your legs, no tension lurking just behind your eyes. It is so unfamiliar that you take a few seconds to trust it. You dress quickly, almost lightly, surprised by the fluidity of your movements. The stairs, which only yesterday you climbed with care, pass under your feet without any particular thought. The air outside is damp but not unpleasant, the clouds hanging low enough to brush the tops of the taller buildings. You walk without a destination, letting your feet choose the streets. There's an almost idle quality to the way you stop at shop windows, a watchmaker's display with gold cases gleaming under gaslight, a bakery with neat rows of loaves stacked behind the glass. And you realize it's because you're not thinking about how long you can stand before the discomfort begins. By late morning, you've wandered back to that same cafe near the market square. The place smells of coffee and warm milk, the air thick with the soft murmur of conversation. You take a seat near the window, the same habit as always, but now it's simply for the view rather than to keep an eye on who's coming and going. The clatter of cups behind the counter doesn't jar you, nor does the occasional scrape of a chair leg on the floor. It's not exactly that you feel at ease. The war has taken that word and buried it somewhere you can't reach. But the constant sense of readiness is gone, and that absence feels close enough. When you return to the boarding house in the early afternoon, there's a faint pressure beginning to gather in your lower back again. You know from experience that it won't stop there. It will work its way upward into your shoulders and down your legs until each movement is something you measure against the price it will exact. You take another tablet without thinking too much about it, the action already sliding into place as part of the day. The bitterness lingers a little longer this time, though it's soon replaced by the steady spread of comfort you felt the night before. The hours pass quietly. You read a newspaper someone left in the hall, though you can't recall much of what you've read by the time you fold it and set it aside. The room feels comfortably dim as the afternoon light fades, the glow from the lamp on your table just enough to hold back the shadows. Outside, a tram rattles by, its bell a small, bright sound in the early evening. You eat, you drink a little tea, and when the stiffness doesn't return before bed, you find yourself tempted to skip the dose. But then you remember how deep the last night's rest was, how complete the absence of interruption, and you see no reason to take the chance. You take the tablet earlier this time, letting it work its way through you before you've even pulled the blankets up. The warmth is not heat exactly, but a loosening, a sense that every joint and muscle is in the right place, moving the right way. Sleep comes even faster, the darkness folding over you like a heavy curtain. The days begin to fold over one another, each one settling into a shape you could almost call routine. You rise later than most of the other tenants, the morning's unhurried, because you've already decided you won't leave the room until you've taken your first dose. Sometimes you stretch it out, letting the faint ache build until it tips just far enough to justify the tablet. Other times you take it before you even open the curtains, enjoying the way it makes the act of standing and dressing feel almost luxurious. The bitter taste no longer makes you grimace. It's simply the first thing you taste most days, like the morning tea others sip downstairs. The walk to the surgery or the chemist has become just another errand. You step inside, give your name, and either collect the small folded packet from behind the counter or wait a short while for the doctor to bring it out himself. There are no questions, no raised eyebrows, no hesitation as the paper changes hands. Heroin is still a legitimate prescription, and you are a respectable patient with a respectable reason. The ease of the exchange makes the whole thing feel orderly, even necessary, as if the world is quietly in agreement that this is the right course. In those early weeks, you still pretend there is a logic to your use, a clear boundary between treatment and indulgence. You tell yourself the morning dose is for the day ahead, the evening dose for rest, and anything in between only for when the pain forces your hand. But the definition of forces shifts gradually. A twinge when you bend to tie your shoes, a hint of pressure in your lower back after a long sit, a restless hour when you should be asleep. All of it now qualifies. The tablets have become an answer to any question your body might ask, whether it is about pain or simply about the mood you want to be in. You start carrying one or two in your coat pocket, tucked into a twist of paper, just in case. At first, you never use them outside your room, convinced they are only there for emergencies. But an afternoon in a crowded street, a cold wind cutting through your coat, a conversation that leaves you unsettled, any of these can be the moment you step into a quiet doorway, slip the tablet past your lips, and feel the faint relief start to spread. It's not always about easing discomfort anymore. Sometimes it's about smoothing the edges of the day before they catch on you. The rhythm changes again when you begin dosing more than twice a day. It's not an intentional decision. One morning you take the usual tablet after breakfast and then, a few hours later, realize the warmth has ebbed sooner than you expected. You tell yourself the cold weather is to blame, or the extra walking you've done, and you take another. The pattern repeats often enough that you stop thinking of it as an exception. Before long, the spaces between doses are just long enough to keep the effect noticeable, never so long that you have to feel the return of the ache in its full force. Your sleep changes too, though you wouldn't call it worse. It's heavier in some ways, less shaped by dreams, but you wake more often in the night to turn over or to sip water. And sometimes you take another tablet then, just to make sure the hours until morning pass without tension. You keep the packet within arm's reach on the bedside table, and there is a small but definite comfort in knowing it's there when you need it. The habit is no longer just about relief. It is about the assurance of relief, the knowledge that you won't have to endure even the start of discomfort if you don't want to. By the second month, the lines between needed and wanted have blurred entirely. You dose before walks, before sitting down to read, before writing letters, before the thought of writing letters. The association between the tablets and comfort is so fixed that sometimes you feel the first stirrings of relief just by unwrapping the paper. On cold mornings, you let the bitterness linger on your tongue, finding in it not just the promise of ease, but the familiarity of something constant in a world that has felt so unpredictable since your return. The moments without it are now the exception rather than the rule. When you delay a dose because you're waiting for a delivery at the boarding house, or because the conversation in a cafe runs long, you feel the absence in small but insistent ways. A faint tightening in your back, a slow return of the vigilance you carry in your shoulders, a little more edge in your thoughts. The contrast makes the return of relief feel all the more valuable, like a reward for having put up with the interval. You start to think of those moments of waiting as unnecessary. Why postpone comfort when you can simply take it? The world outside your room shrinks slightly as the weeks go on. You still walk and still visit the cafes, but you avoid long outings that would require you to carry more than a couple of tablets. Travel feels less appealing, not because of the destinations, but because of the inconvenience of planning doses around the journey. You don't speak of any of this to the doctor, who still writes the prescriptions with the same even hand, or to the chemist, who still folds the paper without question. The arrangement works. There's no reason to alter it. On certain evenings, especially after a day when the cold has made your joints feel stiff and uncooperative, you take a little extra before bed. You tell yourself it's just to guarantee a full night's sleep, but the truth is you've come to enjoy the way the stronger warmth spreads through you, pulling you down into a depth of rest you can't quite reach otherwise. Those nights, you fall asleep with the quiet certainty that you will wake without the faintest echo of pain, and that knowledge is almost as pleasant as the sensation itself. It's during one of these evenings, the packet open on the table, the lamplight turning the white paper a soft yellow, that you catch yourself counting what's left. You tell yourself it's just to see if you'll need to visit the chemist tomorrow or the next day, but the thought that follows is less comfortable. You picture the paper lying empty on the table, the next refill delayed by some unexpected closure or absence, and the idea leaves you with a faint unease. You remind yourself that it's still legal, still easy to get, that the doctor has never hesitated, but the image lingers all the same. Later, when you're ready to sleep, you glance at the packet again, just to be certain of its weight and shape. The paper folds are still neat, but you can feel the smaller size of the contents when you lift it. It's enough for now, more than enough until the next errand. Yet the reassurance you expect from that knowledge doesn't quite come. You slide it back into its place on the table and turn down the lamp, the thought of running low trailing you into the dark. It begins as an ordinary morning, the kind you've settled into over the past weeks. The light through the curtains is the flat grey of a winter sky, the air in the room cool enough that you keep the blankets pulled up for a moment before swinging your feet to the floor. You reach for the packet on the table beside the bed, not because the pain is bad, it rarely gets the chance anymore, but because it's how you start the day. The folds of the paper are familiar under your fingers, the small weight inside a quiet reassurance. But when you open it, there's nothing left. You close it again, instinctively, as if the act might change what you've just seen. The paper crackles, empty. It's not a crisis, not yet. The chemist is only a short walk away, and the last time you checked there was no trouble in getting more. You dress quickly, pulling on your coat and scarf, and step out into the cold. The streets are still damp from an early frost. The cobblestones slick in places. Your breath curls in the air. The short walk feels longer than usual, though you tell yourself it's only the weather slowing you down. When you reach the chemist's shop, the bell over the door gives its usual tired ring, and the air inside smells faintly of camphor and soap. The assistant behind the counter is someone you've seen often enough to recognize, a young man with neat hair, and the kind of polite reserve that never tips into friendliness. You give your name, expecting the usual nod, and the familiar sight of the small folded packet appearing from behind the counter. Instead, he hesitates. His expression doesn't change much, but there's a pause before he says, "I'm sorry, sir. We've none in stock today." For a moment, you don't quite follow. The words land without meaning, and you wait for him to go on, to explain when it will be ready. He adds, "We expect more in tomorrow's delivery. You can call by then." His tone is apologetic in the way people are when something is slightly inconvenient, but easily resolved. You nod, say something about returning tomorrow, and leave. It's a simple delay, nothing more. Outside, the air feels colder than when you came in. You tell yourself it's because the chemist was warm, and the change is more noticeable. The walk back to the boarding house is uneventful, though you feel oddly aware of the way your feet meet the ground, of the way the winter wind pushes against your coat. In your room you sit for a moment, considering whether to go to the surgery instead. But it seems unnecessary. The chemist will have the supply tomorrow, and there's no point in making a fuss. Hey there, fellow time travellers and nocturnal adventurers. Tonight, we're doing something utterly wild. We're not just peeking into the past, we're plunging headfirst into it. What would it be like if you suddenly woke up as a German soldier in World War I? I mean, this stuff wasn't just intense, it was like medieval torture meets industrial slaughterhouse intense. Oh, and if you're enjoying these little historical escapades, a little digital high five, that's a like or subscribe, would be super appreciated. I'm genuinely curious where you're all listening from, so drop a comment with your location and what time it is there. It always blows my mind how people are falling asleep to this all over the world. Right, enough chit-chat. Find that cozy spot. Take a nice, slow, fortifying breath, and just let your body sink into whatever glorious softness you're currently occupying. We're heading back to August 1914, and trust me, you're going to be real grateful for that mattress by the time we're done. Welcome to the Kaiser's Army. Hope you like wool and weak coffee. So, congratulations. You just woke up in August 1914, not in your comfy bed, but in a rather unglamorous barracks somewhere in Germany. Your eyes flutter open to dim morning light, filtering through small, suspiciously grimy windows. The straw-filled mattress beneath you crinkles with a sound suspiciously like a bag of potato chips as you shift. Around you, dozens of other men are stirring, a symphony of groans and stretches, some already pulling on their field grey uniforms, looking like a collection of hastily assembled, slightly grumpy pigeons. Your nostrils fill with the distinct aroma of wool uniforms, stiff leather boots, and the ode to too many men packed into too small a space. Somewhere, a hopeful soul is brewing coffee. Not real coffee, mind you, but the kind of weak, grainy, vaguely brown substitute that only passes for coffee in military quarters. It probably tastes like regret and boiled socks. You sit up, your back protesting loudly from the thin, unforgiving mattress. Suddenly a bell clangs outside, sounding less like a gentle wake-up call and more like a furious blacksmith attacking an anvil. Everyone's moving faster, a chaotic flurry of limbs and fabric. You're swept up in it, your body moving with an uncanny, unsettling familiarity, like you've done this 1,000 times. "Schnell, schnell," someone shouts. "Quick, quick!" And just like that, you're dressed in a scratchy wool uniform, what they call field grey, but it's more like a greenish grey that quickly fades to a duller, sadder shade after one too many washes. The boots are stiff leather, yet surprisingly, they're already worn in the right places for your feet. That's weird, right? Like they've been yours for months, even though your brain is screaming, "Who am I, and why do I smell like a damp sheep?" The jacket buttons up tight around your neck with shiny silver buttons that you instinctively know not to polish too brightly. Don't want to make yourself a shimmering target, do we? You slap a simple field cap on your head. No fancy spiked helmet yet, that's for later, for when you're feeling really intimidating. And somehow you just know. You know, in your gut, in your bones, that war has just been declared. The air crackles with an almost dizzying excitement. Everyone's talking about being home by Christmas, maybe even by Thanksgiving if they're feeling ambitious. We'll march through Belgium, knock out France real quick, then deal with Russia. Simple plan. It's like they're planning a particularly aggressive holiday itinerary. You, this new you, have trained for this. Every able-bodied German man has. Basically, you're part of the Kaiser's army now. Not exactly by choice, mind you. In Germany, military service has been compulsory for men since forever. 2 or 3 years of active service starting at age 20. But here's the truly bizarre thing. Almost nobody here is complaining. It's 1914, and the whole country is swept up in a fever pitch of patriotic fervour. "We'll be in Paris in a month," bellows the guy beside you, who you somehow know is named Heinrich. He's grinning, a wide, enthusiastic, slightly terrifying grin, as he straps on his gear. "The French will run at the first sight of us." You nod, a knot forming in your gut. Maybe it's the fact that you, the real you, know exactly how this all turns out, all 4 long, bloody years of it. Or maybe it's just breakfast, a chunk of dark bread that looks like it was baked from sawdust, and that coffee substitute that genuinely tastes like dirt. Delicious. The Great March West. Hope, naivete, and a whole lot of dust. Outside, thousands of men are gathering, a grey-green tide ready to roll. Your equipment feels heavy but familiar, like an old, uncomfortable friend. You've got this leather belt around your waist, with pouches bulging with 120 rounds for your Mauser rifle. A bread bag hangs at your side, holding your meagre personal items and rations. Probably more sawdust bread. Your canteen, filled with lukewarm water, rattles against it. At your hip is a bayonet, a brutal, pointy thing, thicker and more menacing than the British equivalent. The rifle itself, the Gewehr 98, feels solid in your hands, long, accurate, but you instinctively know it'll be awkward as heck in tight spaces. 5 rounds in the chamber. You've drilled with it hundreds of times, your body remembers the movements even if your mind is still doing a frantic inventory of your past life. The morning is bright and warm, a perfect summer's day in Germany. People line the streets as your regiment marches toward the train station. Girls throw flowers, probably thinking they're sending off heroes to a quick, glorious victory. Old men salute, tears in their eyes, filled with pride. Everyone cheers, a roar of patriotic excitement. You march and march, swept along in this seemingly endless river of field-grey uniforms. Thousands upon thousands of men, all headed to war with smiles on their faces, completely oblivious to the unimaginable horror that awaits them. If only they knew what 4 years of trench warfare would do to those smiles. The train takes you west, rumbling towards Belgium. Inside, the mood is still strangely festive. Guys are singing patriotic songs, their voices surprisingly strong, playing cards, writing earnest, naive letters home. It's like a holiday mood, a grand adventure. And why not? The officers keep saying you'll be home by Christmas, a mantra repeated so often it almost sounds convincing. The Kaiser says it's necessary, Heinrich tells you, his face serious now, the grin replaced by a determined frown. France and Russia were going to attack us anyway. Britain too, probably. We're just beating them to it. Preemptive strike, you know. You nod again. What else can you do? Argue with the war fever? Tell them about Verdun? That would earn you a very swift trip to the nearest padded cell, or worse. Days pass in a blur of marching, punctuated by more train rides, then more marching. The initial excitement begins to wear thin, replaced by a dull ache. The weight of your pack digs into your shoulders like a tiny, persistent torturer. Your feet, initially pristine, develop blisters the size of small plums, then harden into calluses that feel like concrete. The summer heat makes your scratchy wool uniform stick to your skin with sweat, like a second, less pleasant skin. The wool itself smells worse each day, a pungent mixture of body odour, damp earth and existential dread. The Belgian border, where reality hits harder than a Mauser buttstock. And then suddenly you're at the Belgian border. The festive mood has evaporated faster than a puddle in the Sahara. The officers are shouting orders, their voices now sharper, laced with genuine tension. This is it. The war is about to begin for real. Nobody looks so cheerful anymore. Reality, with all the subtlety of an artillery shell, is setting in. The Belgians, surprisingly, aren't just letting you pass through like a polite tourist group. They're going to fight. And the British have joined the war too, which wasn't supposed to happen so fast, was it? Their army was supposed to be a small, easily dispatched nuisance. Clearly someone didn't read the memo. Your battalion moves through small Belgian towns. Some are already burning, columns of smoke curling into the summer sky. Civilians watch from windows, their faces etched with fear and unmistakably hatred. You've heard unsettling rumours that Belgian civilians are attacking German soldiers, franc-tireurs they call them. So everyone's on edge, twitchy, trigger fingers ready. Any shadow, any sudden movement could mean danger. And then comes your first battle. It happens so fast you don't even register it. One moment you're marching down a country road, the sun glinting off your bayonet. The next you're diving for cover as bullets whiz overhead with a terrifying hum. The noise. That's what gets you first. It's not just loud, it's deafening. Rifles crack like thunder, machine guns chatter like angry metallic birds. Men scream, some in pain, some in terror. Artillery shells shriek through the air before exploding in geysers of dirt and metal, tearing the landscape apart. You find yourself firing your rifle at vague shapes in the distance. Are they Belgian? French? You can barely tell through the smoke and chaos. Your training takes over, a primal automatic response. Load, aim, fire. Load, aim, fire. The rifle butt slams into your shoulder with each shot, a jarring rhythm of destruction. Then, Heinrich, your enthusiastic companion, goes down beside you, clutching his leg, a wet, dark stain spreading across his uniform. Blood seeps between his fingers. The smell of copper fills the air. For a fleeting second, you panic, but then instinct kicks in. You help drag him behind a crumbling wall, your muscles straining, then your back firing again, a cog in this horrifying machine. Hours blur together into a meaningless sequence of noise and terror. By nightfall, you're utterly exhausted, your ears ringing, hands shaking so badly you can barely hold your rifle. But you're alive, and your side has won this small, brutal engagement. The Belgians have retreated, leaving behind a silence that feels heavier than the noise. That night, you sleep in a farmhouse that's been abandoned, its previous occupants having fled the advancing tide. You're too tired to even remove your boots, too weary to care about the straw poking your back. Your dreams are vivid, distorted replays of the battle, filled with the sounds of rifle fire and screaming. You jerk awake at every noise, every creak of the house, every rustle of the wind. The illusions of progress and the dawn of the trenches. The push continues. Each day brings more fighting, more marching, more death. But you're moving forward, always forward, deeper into France. The great Schlieffen Plan, the grand strategy to swing wide through Belgium and then down into France, encircling Paris from the north, seems to be working. Except, of course, it isn't quite working as planned. The plucky Belgians slowed you down with their unexpected resistance. The British are fighting harder alongside the French than anyone anticipated, like particularly stubborn terriers. And the Russians? They've mobilized faster than expected in the east, forcing Germany to divert precious troops, diluting the hammer blow in the west. By early September, you're utterly exhausted. Your unit has been marching and fighting for a month straight. Your uniform, once merely field grey, is now a caked, filthy, malodorous testament to grime and sweat. Your body is thin from inconsistent meals, your face gaunt, shadowed. But you've made it close to Paris. Victory seems tantalizingly within reach, just beyond the next muddy field. Then the order comes. The word echoes through the lines, unthinkable, demoralizing, retreat. The French and British have counterattacked at the Marne River, a desperate last-ditch effort. The German advance, once an unstoppable tide, has been stopped, ground to a halt. You fall back with the rest of your unit, confused and utterly demoralized. This wasn't supposed to happen. Paris was almost within reach. Now, you're digging in, north of the Aisne River, frantically creating defensive positions. And that, dear listener, is how it truly begins. The trenches. At first, they're just shallow scrapes in the dirt, hastily dug ditches, places to take cover from enemy fire. But as days turn into weeks, and weeks into months, they grow deeper, more complex, like an insidious network of subterranean mole tunnels. By October, you're no longer just taking cover. you're living in a trench. The autumn rains have started, turning the trench floors into a thick, viscous mud that sucks at your boots with every step. You slosh through water that sometimes reaches your knees, a cold, miserable embrace. Your feet are constantly wet, the skin starting to rot away. Trench foot, they call it, a delightful condition that can lead to gangrene and amputation. But here's the thing about German trenches. They're generally better built than the Allied ones. The Germans, ever practical, are planning to stay on the defensive now, holding what they've gained in Belgium and northern France, while dealing with the unexpected headache of Russia in the east. So, your officers have you digging deeper, reinforcing the walls with timber and sandbags. In some places they even use concrete, a true luxury. The trenches are dug in a meticulous zigzag pattern, a defensive maze designed to limit the damage from shell explosions. You help build dugouts into the sides of the trenches, underground rooms where you can shelter from artillery bombardments. Unlike the British dugouts, which are usually just a few feet deep and offer little protection, the German ones go down 12 feet or more, sometimes with multiple levels connected by crude wooden stairs. It's hard, back-breaking work, but it gives you something to do, something to focus on beyond the constant threat of death. And when it's finished, you have relatively safe places to sleep, eat, and even relax a bit. Some dugouts, eventually, get electric lights powered by generators somewhere behind the lines. Absolute luxury compared to what the British and French have to contend with. The soul-crushing routine of trench life, rats, lice, and the smell of despair. The routine of trench life quickly becomes your new normal, a monotonous cycle of survival. You stand watch at dawn and dusk when attacks are most likely. You work on strengthening the trenches during the day, endlessly shoring up collapsing walls, pumping out water, checking and cleaning your rifle for the 100th time. At night, you send out patrols to scout no man's land, that desolate, shell-blasted strip of ground between the opposing trench lines, or to raid enemy trenches, hoping to capture a prisoner for intelligence. Food is decent enough at first. Dark bread, sausage, sometimes even fresh meat, potatoes and vegetables. Coffee, or at least that terrible substitute, and beer, occasionally, if you're lucky. Each day, you get 2 cigars or cigarettes, small smoky comforts in a world devoid of pleasure. But the boredom, that's almost worse than the fear. Hours and hours of nothing happening, just the endless waiting. You write letters home, play cards with the other men, clean your rifle for the 1000th time, polish your boots even though they'll be covered in mud again in 5 minutes. And then there are the rats. Oh, the rats. Massive things, fat and bold, grown plump from feeding on the corpses in no man's land. They scurry through the trenches at night, unafraid, so bold they'll run across your body while you're trying to sleep, their tiny claws like icy needles. And the lice. Tiny, insidious creatures infesting your uniform, biting incessantly, driving you mad. You can feel them crawling on your skin, a constant maddening itch that never ever stops. The smell. Ah, the smell. It's something else entirely. A putrid, pervasive stench of mud, human waste, unwashed bodies, rotting food, and, most sickeningly, the sweet, cloying odour of corpses decomposing just outside the trench, or even buried beneath your feet. You stop noticing it after a while, surprisingly. Your nose, a loyal but weary servant, adjusts to the constant assault. Winter comes, bringing with it freezing temperatures. The mud turns to solid ice, then thaws back into viscous mud, then freezes again. Your feet are never warm, no matter how many layers of soggy wool you wrap them in. You huddle with the other men in your dugout for warmth, personal space long forgotten, sharing body heat like a collective, miserable bear. Christmas 1914, a fleeting miracle. Christmas 1914 arrives. You're still in France, not home, like everyone so naively promised. But then, something truly strange happens. The firing stops. Across no man's land, you can hear the British singing carols, their voices surprisingly clear in the sudden silence. Someone on your side, perhaps driven by a desperate longing for home, starts singing too. Before the officers can even process it, men from both sides are cautiously climbing out of their trenches, meeting in no man's land, a no man's land suddenly transformed into a temporary, surreal truce zone. They exchange small gifts, cigarettes, chocolate, badges. There's even a spontaneous football, soccer game for a few glorious hours. For a brief, incredible moment, there's no war, just men who want to be home, finding a fleeting moment of peace and shared humanity. But it doesn't last. The officers, horrified by this breach of military protocol, quickly put an end to it. The war, cold and brutal, resumes. The momentary truce becomes a wistful, almost unbelievable memory. New horrors and the grind of years. The uniform changes. So does your soul. And now there's a new horror to face. In April 1915, near Ypres, your commanders try something new, something truly insidious. Gas. Chlorine gas, released from cylinders, forming a greenish-yellow cloud that drifts slowly, inexorably toward the enemy trenches. You watch from a distance, your new gas mask clutched in your hand, ready. The Allied soldiers opposite have no protection. They cough, choke, vomit, and die. Their lungs dissolved from the inside out. It opens a terrifying gap in their line, but the German forces aren't ready to exploit it fully. And soon enough, horrifyingly, the Allies have gas too. Now, you have to worry about this new invisible poison drifting into your trench, turning the very air you breathe into a weapon. Your gas mask, cumbersome and uncomfortable, restricting your vision and breathing, becomes your new best friend. It's better than having your lungs melt. The war grinds on. 1915 passes, a blur of mud and misery. Then 1916, major battles flare up. Verdun, the Somme. Battles that devour men like a hungry beast. Millions dying for gains measured in mere yards. Your world shrinks to the few hundred yards of trench that your unit occupies. You know every corner of it, which boards are loose, where the best shelter is during artillery bombardments, which parts flood worst after rain. Your body settles into this new, grotesque normal. You sleep lightly, one ear always alert for danger. You can tell the difference between dozens of shell types just by their sound as they fly overhead. You know exactly how long it takes to put on your gas mask in the dark. Friends die. New men arrive to replace them. They look so young, so clean, their eyes still holding the naive spark of pre-war life. They haven't learned yet how to survive in this hell. Many don't last long. You survive because you're careful. You keep your head down. You don't volunteer for dangerous missions. You maintain your equipment like it's your lifeblood. You watch for signs of trench foot and treat it early. But mostly, you survive because of sheer blind luck. The shell that lands 10 feet away instead of directly in your dugout. The sniper who misses by inches. The patrol that chooses the trench section next to yours to raid. And all the while, the war keeps changing, morphing into something ever more monstrous. New weapons appear, terrifying flamethrowers that vomit fire. Better, faster machine guns, more effective, more destructive artillery, and then the ultimate nightmare, tanks, lumbering across no man's land like iron monsters shrugging off rifle fire. You shift a little, getting more comfortable on your imaginary mattress as you think about how, in the middle of all this horror and monotony, the uniform on your back is changing too. The iconic spiked helmet, the Pickelhaube, has given way to the new, more practical Stahlhelm, a steel helmet that actually offers decent protection. Your blue uniform, a relic of earlier wars, has been replaced entirely by field grey. Equipment evolves, adapting to the brutal realities of this new kind of warfare. 1917, the veteran's reality, life underground. By 1917, the war has transformed everything. You've been in the trenches for so long now that civilian life feels like a distant, hazy dream, like a faded photograph. The man you were before the war, he's gone. Replaced by this hollow-eyed veteran who flinches at loud noises, instinctively hits the dirt at the sound of a distant whistle, and can sleep through artillery bombardments that would make a normal person weep in terror. Your trench has become more sophisticated over time. What started as a simple ditch is now an engineering marvel, 12 feet deep in places, reinforced with timber and concrete. Dugouts extend far underground, some big enough to house dozens of men. The officers' dugouts even have proper furniture, salvaged from abandoned houses, a bizarre touch of domesticity in this subterranean hellscape. This morning, you wake in your underground shelter. Unlike the British and French troops, who often sleep in shallow holes or right in the trench itself, your dugout is relatively comfortable. Deep enough that artillery can't reach it unless there's a truly unlucky direct hit. The wooden planks beneath you aren't exactly a feather bed, but they're dry. That's something. The space is crowded with 8 other men, all still sleeping in the dim yellowish light of a single electric bulb, powered by a generator somewhere behind the lines. Their breathing creates a chorus of snores, wheezes, and the occasional soft groan. The air is thick with the pervasive smell of unwashed bodies, damp wool, and stale tobacco. You check your watch. 5:30. Almost time for stand to, when everyone mans the fire step at dawn. The most likely time for an enemy attack. Your body knows the routine so well, you barely need to think about it. You reach for your stall helm, the steel helmet that replaced the old leather pickelhaube. This one actually provides some protection from shrapnel. Running your fingers over its surface, you can feel the dents and scratches from countless near misses, each one a tiny, terrifying reminder of a time you almost died. Outside, the pre-dawn air is chilly, the kind of crisp cold that heralds spring in northern France. A light mist hangs over no man's land, obscuring the British trenches opposite. They're about 80 yards away, though it might as well be 80 miles for all the chances of reaching them alive in daylight. "Anything?" you ask the night sentry, a young kid who couldn't be more than 18, his face pale and drawn in the gloom. He shakes his head. Quiet night. Some rifle fire around midnight. Nothing close. You nod, a silent acknowledgement of a precious gift. Another quiet night. You take your position on the fire step, a narrow ledge that allows you to peer over the parapet with your rifle ready. All along the trench, other men are doing the same, spaced out at regular intervals, eyes scanning the mist for any movement. This is the morning hate ritual. As visibility improves, both sides usually fire a few desultory rounds into the mist, just to let the other side know you're awake and alert. No one expects to hit anything. It's just part of the daily weary rhythm of the front. Your stomach growls. Rations have been getting worse. A slow, agonizing decline. The British naval blockade has been strangling Germany for years now, like a tightening noose. Food shortages back home mean less for the front. The fat sausages and fresh bread of 1914 are long gone. Now it's thin soup, hard bread that could double as a brick, and sometimes a bit of preserved meat that might be horse, or might be something else entirely. You try not to think about it too much. The tin cup of coffee in your hand is barely warm. It tastes nothing like actual coffee. It's made from roasted barley and chicory, but it's hot and slightly bitter. Good enough. "Stand down," comes the order. As full daylight arrives with no sign of attack, the morning hate passes with just a few isolated shots fired into the mist. Everyone's saving ammunition these days. Now comes the daily routine. Some men will sleep, taking advantage of the relative quiet of daylight hours. Others will perform the endless maintenance tasks, repairing damaged sections of trench, pumping out water, endlessly checking and cleaning weapons. You've been assigned to a working party today. That means leaving the relative safety of the trench to string barbed wire in no man's land tonight. A dangerous job, but not until after dark. Letter home and the scent of death. For now, you have time to write a letter home. Settling on an ammunition box in a quiet corner of the trench, you pull out a pencil and stubbornly clean paper. What to tell your family? Certainly not the truth. The censors would cut it out anyway. So, you write about the weather, how lovely the French spring is, ask about the neighbours, mention a few friends who are still alive. You carefully avoid mentioning the ones who aren't. "Post going out today?" asked Heinrich, who somehow, miraculously, survived that leg wound 3 years ago. He walks with a pronounced limp now, but stubbornly refused to accept a discharge. He said he'd rather be with his comrades than trying to explain the war to civilians who could never possibly understand. "That's what I heard," you say, folding the letter carefully. Though, who knows when it'll actually reach home. Heinrich nods, his face gaunt and streaked with dirt beneath a week's growth of beard. "My wife's last letter took 2 months to get here. said they're eating turnips and bread made with sawdust. You've heard similar stories from others. The home front is suffering almost as much as the soldiers. Almost. The day drags on. You clean your rifle, check your gas mask, eat a meagre midday meal of soup and hard bread. The soup has a few chunks of mystery meat and some unidentified vegetables floating in it. Better than nothing. In the afternoon you try to nap, knowing you'll be up all night with a wire-laying detail. Sleep comes fitfully, even in the relative safety of the dugout. Your body stays partially alert, one ear always listening, ready to respond to the shrill alarm that signals a gas attack or the distinctive, terrifying sound of an incoming shell. As dusk approaches, it's stand to again. Everyone back on the fire step, watching for movement as the light fades. This is another dangerous time, a prime opportunity for enemy attacks. After dark, you gather with the wire-laying detail. 8 men, led by a corporal who's been doing this since 1915, and somehow, miraculously, hasn't been killed or wounded yet. That's the kind of luck you want to stay close to. We go out through the sap trench, the corporal explains in a low voice, pointing to a narrow, shallow trench that extends out toward no man's land. Work in pairs. One holds the wire, one hammers in the stakes. Keep it quiet. If we're spotted, drop everything and get back to our lines fast. Questions? Nobody has questions. You've all done this before. You know the risks. You're paired with a newer guy, Schmidt. He's been at the front for 3 months, which makes him practically a veteran at this point. The turnover is tragically high. You want to hold or hammer? You ask him. I'll hammer, he says, his voice a little shaky. Steadier hands? You nod. That means you'll be handling the barbed wire itself, which inevitably leads to cuts and scratches, no matter how careful you are with the gloves. But Schmidt is right. The hammering needs to be done as quietly as possible, with steady, controlled movements. It's the harder job, the one that can give away your position. No man's land, a deadly dance in the dark. The group moves out through the sap trench, then crawls the last 20 yards or so to the position where the new wire will go. The night is cloudy, which is good. It makes it harder for the British to spot you, but there's just enough moonlight filtering through the gaps in the clouds to see what you're doing. For the next 2 hours you work in near silence, unrolling wire and holding it in place while Schmidt hammers in the metal stakes. The only sounds are the dull thud of hammer on stake, muffled by a cloth wrap, and the occasional distant crack of a rifle shot somewhere along the line, a constant reminder of the ever-present danger. Your hands sting from a dozen small cuts where the barbed wire has penetrated your gloves. Your back aches from hunching over in the cold mud. Every few minutes you freeze in place when a flare goes up, casting harsh, sudden light and long, dancing shadows across no man's land. If you don't move, if you become part of the static landscape, the British sentries might not spot you. Finally, the new wire is in place. The corporal signals for everyone to return to the trench. You move carefully backwards, still hunched over, trying to avoid the older rusted strands of wire that litter no man's land like a deadly metal spiderweb. You're almost to the sap trench when a flare goes up directly overhead. Its harsh white light freezes everyone in place, suspended in a moment of terrifying illumination. But someone, you never find out who, panics and makes a desperate dash for the trench. Immediately, machine gun fire erupts from the British line, a furious, chattering roar. Bullets zip and crack through the air around you, sounding like angry, buzzing insects. You press yourself flat against the ground, face buried in the cold, wet mud, praying, bargaining, hoping none of those bullets finds you. The man who ran makes it about 10 yards before going down. You can hear his muffled screams for help, weak and fading, but no one moves. Can't risk more lives. After what feels like hours, but is probably just minutes, the British fire slackens. They can't maintain it all night, and they can't be sure of hitting anything in the dark. The flare burns out, plunging you back into the blessed, if still terrifying darkness. Back to the trench, the corporal whispers, his voice low and urgent. Now, crawl. You don't need to be told twice. On your belly, you crawl the remaining distance to the sap trench, then scurry along it back to the relative safety of the main line. Your uniform is caked with mud, your hands bleeding from the wire cuts. But you're alive. The wounded man is still out there. His cries have grown weaker, almost imperceptible. A patrol might go out for him later if the officers deem it worth the risk. Often, they don't. Back in the relative safety of the main trench, you slump against the wall, exhausted, your heart still racing from the close call. Schmidt sits beside you, his face pale in the darkness. "Smoke?" he offers, holding out a crumpled cigarette. You take it gratefully. Tobacco is another thing that's been rationed severely, but most men save their allotment for moments like this, when the nerves need steadying. The match flares briefly, illuminating Schmidt's young face. In that instant, you see the fear he's trying to hide. The same fear you've been carrying for 3 years now. The fear you've just gotten better at concealing. You inhale deeply, letting the harsh smoke fill your lungs. It's calming, familiar, a small, fleeting pleasure in a world that offers few. "Think they'll send a patrol for Miller?" Schmidt asks quietly, naming the man who was hit. You shrug. "Depends if they think he's still alive, and how busy the Tommies are tonight." Schmidt nods, understanding the harsh calculus of the front. No use risking more lives for a man who's probably already dead, or who will die before you can get him back to the aid station. The rest of the night passes in the usual routine. You clean yourself up as best you can, bandage the worst of the cuts on your hands, eat a cold ration of bread and some preserved meat from your bread bag. Then you take your turn on sentry duty, staring out into the darkness, listening for any sound that might indicate a British patrol or raid. 1918, the last great gamble, stormtroopers and a fading hope. The next day brings news. Another big offensive is coming. The rumours have been circulating for weeks, a nervous undercurrent, but now it's official. The spring offensive of 1918, Germany's last great push to win the war before American troops, fresh and seemingly endless, arrive in large numbers. The plan sounds ambitious, daring. Break through the British lines, drive to the Channel ports, cut off their supply lines, end the war before the Americans can make a difference. But you've heard big plans before. The Schlieffen Plan in 1914, the attack on Verdun in 1916 that was supposed to bleed France white. None of them delivered the promised victory. Still, there's a different feeling this time. Units from the Eastern Front are arriving daily, freed up by Russia's chaotic exit from the war. New tactics have been developed. Stormtroopers, special assault troops, have been training for months in new, frightening methods of attack. For the first time in years, there's a flicker of possibility. Maybe, just maybe, this war can still be won. The preparations are intense. Training in the new infiltration tactics, stockpiling ammunition and supplies, bringing up artillery, all done as secretly as possible to maintain the element of surprise. You find yourself assigned to a stormtrooper unit, based on your experience and surprisingly good physical condition, a rarity after years of poor rations. The training is different from anything you've done before. Instead of mass attacks across no man's land into machine gun fire, you'll be moving in small, agile groups, bypassing strong points, pushing deep into enemy territory. The weapons are different too. More machine guns, many of them lighter models that can be carried by 1 or 2 men. Flamethrowers, the new MP-18 submachine guns, automatic weapons perfect for trench clearing, and plenty of grenades, both the stick type and the egg-shaped models. The training is exhausting, brutal, but it's also the most interesting thing you've done in years. It feels good to be moving, to be active, instead of just sitting in a trench waiting for shells to fall. And there's better food, at least temporarily. The army is making sure the assault troops are well fed. Meat appears in the stew again. There's even real coffee occasionally, a luxury you'd almost forgotten existed. As the offensive draws closer, tension builds to a fever pitch. Everyone knows this is Germany's last best chance. The British and French are exhausted too, their armies depleted by years of grinding warfare. But the Americans are coming. Fresh troops, vast industrial capacity, seemingly limitless resources. It has to be now or never. The night before the attack, you try to sleep but can't. No one can. The dugout is filled with restless men, silently checking equipment, writing last letters home, quietly talking in small groups, their voices hushed. You think about all you've survived to reach this point. The early, chaotic battles in Belgium, the disheartening retreat from the Marne, years of soul-crushing trench warfare, terrifying gas attacks, artillery bombardments that turned the landscape into a cratered moonscape, desperate raids and counter-raids across no man's land. So many close calls. The bullet that passed through your sleeve without touching skin. The shell that buried you alive until your comrades dug you out, gasping for air. The gas attack where your mask leaked slightly, leaving you coughing blood for days, but still alive when others around you died. And now, it all comes down to this. One massive, desperate push to break the stalemate and finally, mercifully, end the war. Will you survive this too? The odds aren't good. The initial assault troops always suffer the heaviest casualties. But what choice do you have? Desert. You'd likely be caught and shot. And where would you go anyway? The enemy lines are just as dangerous, and home is hundreds of miles away across a war zone. Number. You'll do your duty, like you always have. Follow orders. Try to stay alive. That's all anyone can do in this absurd, monstrous war. Over the top, the final gambit. As dawn approaches, you gear up. The Stahlhelm sits heavy on your head, a familiar weight. Your ammunition pouches are full, pressing against your sides. Extra grenades, stick and egg, hang ominously from your belt. The MP-18 submachine gun is a comforting weight in your hands, far more effective for close combat in a trench than the old Mauser rifle. Your body feels tense, wired, but ready. 4 years of war have turned you into something you never expected to be. A professional soldier, honed by horror, skilled in the art of killing and surviving. Around you, thousands of other men are preparing in the same way. The trenches are packed with troops far more than usual, a living wave compressed before the crest. The attack will come on a wide front, a massive, desperate effort to rupture the Allied lines. Then, the artillery begins, even before dawn. Thousands of guns firing in a carefully orchestrated bombardment. Not the days-long shelling that telegraphs an attack, but a short, intense barrage designed to stun and suppress, to drive the enemy underground rather than to utterly destroy their trenches. Gas shells mix with high explosives, forcing the British to don their masks, making it harder for them to fight, blinding and disorienting them when the assault comes. You check your watch, counting down the minutes, each tick a hammer blow against your nerves. The bombardment will last exactly 2 hours. Then you go over the top. Your mouth is dry, your throat constricted. Your heart pounds in your chest like a trapped bird. Around you, men make final, quiet adjustments to their equipment. Some praying quietly, lips moving without sound, others silent, lost in their own terrified thoughts. The roar of the guns is deafening, a continuous apocalyptic thunder. Even in the dugout, deep underground, the ground shakes with each impact. Dust filters down from the ceiling, gritty on your tongue. Then the whistle blows. It's time. You climb the steps to the trench, then up to the fire step. The sky is just beginning to lighten with the first hint of dawn. Smoke and dust from the bombardment hang thick in the air, providing a meagre, welcome cover. The officer gives the signal, a hand raised, then dropped, and you're up and over the parapet, moving forward in a low crouch, not the headlong, suicidal rush of earlier attacks. The stormtrooper tactics call for infiltration, finding weak points, bypassing strong resistance. The ground of no man's land is a nightmare landscape of shell holes, tangles of rusted barbed wire, and debris, the accumulated detritus of years of death. But the engineers have cut paths through the wire, marked with white tape. You follow these paths, moving as quickly as possible while staying low. Surprisingly, there's little immediate fire from the British lines. The bombardment has done its job, forcing them to keep their heads down, disrupting their communications. Your squad reaches the first British trench and drops into it. A few defenders are still there, dazed from the shelling, spitting curses. Brief, violent, close-quarter fighting erupts. The MP-18 proves its worth, sweeping the trench with automatic fire, a terrifying, efficient weapon. Grenades are tossed into dugouts, followed by muffled thuds and desperate cries. Within minutes, this section of trench is secured, but you don't stay to consolidate. That's for the regular infantry following behind. The stormtroopers push on, heading for the second line of trenches, then beyond. And, incredibly, it's working. The British defences are crumbling under the coordinated assault. The combination of the new tactics, the short, sharp bombardment, and the sheer, overwhelming weight of German numbers is crushing them. By mid-morning, you've advanced further in a few hours than either side has managed in years of previous fighting. The breakthrough you've all been waiting for, the mythical turning point, seems to be happening. The exhilaration of movement, of advance, after years of static, claustrophobic trench warfare, is intoxicating. Despite the danger, despite the mounting casualties, there's a wild, desperate energy in pushing forward in seeing the enemy retreat. By nightfall, your unit has penetrated miles behind what was the British front line that morning. You're utterly exhausted, hungry, thirsty, your muscles screaming but triumphant. For the first time in years, it feels like the war might actually end and Germany might actually win. As you settle into a captured British dugout for a few hours of rest, the air still thick with the smell of explosives and despair, you allow yourself to imagine going home. Not just on leave, but for good. The war over, peace, normal life. It seems almost within reach now, a fragile, beautiful dream. You stretch out on a British army cot, surprisingly more comfortable than anything you've slept on in months. Your muscles gradually relax. The searing tension of the day's fighting slowly ebbs away. Despite the distant rumble of artillery and the unfamiliar surroundings, your body is surrendering to exhaustion. You shift slightly, finding that perfect spot as your breathing naturally slows. And just for a moment, a rare, precious moment, you allow yourself to hope that this offensive might really be the one that ends it all. The offensive stalls, the long retreat begins. The offensive continues for days, then weeks. The initial elation of that first breakthrough, that intoxicating taste of victory, slowly fades as the advance begins to slow, then sputter. The British and French are falling back, yes, but they're doing so in good order. They're not breaking, not collapsing as the High Command had predicted. And now the supply lines are becoming a crippling problem. Your stormtrooper unit has advanced so far, so fast, that the regular infantry and the vital supply wagons simply can't keep up. You're running desperately low on ammunition, food, even water. The countryside you're moving through has been utterly ravaged by years of war. There's little to forage, only desolation. "We've outrun our artillery," Heinrich says one evening, his voice hollow, as your squad settles into yet another abandoned farmhouse for the night. His face is gaunt, streaked with dirt and gunpowder, his eyes holding a familiar weariness. Can't advance without support. He's right. The momentum is visibly slowing. The British are bringing up reserves, fresh divisions, strengthening their lines. The easy, exhilarating gains of the first days are becoming agonizingly costly yards, won only with blood and sacrifice. And then there's something else, something new, something terrifying appearing on the battlefield in ever-increasing numbers. "Tanks," says Schmidt, who against all odds survived the initial assault with you. "More of them each day, and they're getting better at using them." The early British tanks were mechanical oddities, slow and unreliable, often getting stuck in the mud. But these new ones, these are faster, more powerful, and used in greater numbers, rolling across the shell-pocked landscape like iron monsters, spitting fire and defying rifle bullets. They're a demoralizing sight. The American troops are also beginning to arrive in significant numbers. Their fresh faces and seemingly endless supplies a stark contrast to your own exhausted, depleted forces. You see them captured sometimes, well-fed, well-equipped, almost arrogant in their confidence. Their presence is a crushing weight on morale. The spring offensive, which began with such desperate hope, is slowly, inevitably grinding to a halt. The dreams of Paris by summer are fading, replaced by the grim reality of more fighting, more death, and a retreat that feels increasingly less like a tactical maneuver and more like a desperate rout. The war, you realize with a cold dread, is far from over, and for the first time you allow yourself to truly believe that Germany might not win. Quite the whirlwind tour through a very, very bad time to be alive, right? I imagine you're feeling extra grateful for that mattress now, and perhaps a hot cup of actual coffee. What part of this grim little adventure would you least like to experience in real life?